Good afternoon. This is Stephanie Loop. In this presentation, we will be discussing accommodating children with disabilities in the school meal programs, guidance for school food service professionals. The National School Lunch Program, or NSLP, and the School Breakfast Program, or SBP, aim to provide all participating children, regardless of their background, with the nutritious meals they need to be healthy. In order to operate the programs, school food authorities, or SFAs, must enter into an agreement with their respective state agency. As part of this agreement, SFAs must comply with the United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA's, non-discrimination regulation on the basis of handicap in programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance. This is found in 7 CFR 15B. This includes ensuring children with disabilities have an equal opportunity to participate in and benefit from the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 2.8 million school-aged children were reported to have a disability in 2010. It's imperative that SFAs recognize the importance of ensuring access to meal benefits and understand their obligations to provide reasonable modifications for children with disabilities. This presentation is based off of USDA's 2017 edition of Accommodating Children with Disabilities in the School Meal Programs and includes information about statutory and departmental requirements to modify policies, practices, and procedures to accommodate children with disabilities, developing procedural safeguards for modification requests, making a modification to program meals or the meal service area, reimbursement for modified meals, the option to accommodate food preferences for children without disabilities, and additional resources SFAs and schools can use in their efforts to build a safe, inclusive environment for children with disabilities. Please note that this resource does not cover every situation SFAs may encounter related to disabilities and reasonable modifications. Circumstances often vary, and each situation should be considered on a case-by-case basis. SFAs and schools should direct specific questions to the state agency if they are unsure how to proceed. A growing body of federal law clearly requires schools to protect the rights and privileges of children with disabilities and to ensure they have equal access to benefits when compared to children without disabilities. SFAs that fail to make appropriate meal modifications for children with disabilities could be found in violation of federal civil rights laws. This section provides an overview of statutory and regulatory requirements related to disability accommodations. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, otherwise known as Public Law 93-112, prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in any federal government program that receives federal financial assistance. Even $1 of federal money brings the entire scope of operations within their jurisdiction of Section 504, regardless of whether the requested modification is related to the part of the operations receiving federal money. The law includes a local educational agency or a system of vocational education or another school system. By law, recipients of federal financial assistance must make reasonable modifications to accommodate children with disabilities. Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, as amended, prohibits discrimination based on disability in the provision of state and local government services, including services provided by public schools. Title III of the ADA prohibits discrimination based on disability by private entities offering public accommodations, including private schools. The ADA Amendments Act of 2008 was signed into law on September 25th of 2008. The primary purpose of the ADA Amendments Act was to carry out the ADA's objectives for providing a clear and comprehensive national mandate for the elimination of discrimination and clear, strong, consistent, enforceable standards addressing discrimination by reinstating a broad scope of protection available under the ADA. The ADA Amendments Act also emphasized the definition of disability that it should be construed in the favor of broad coverage to the maximum extent permitted. According to the ADA, the term disability means a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of such individual, a record of such impairment, or being regarded as having such an impairment. The ADA lists several examples of major life activities that could be impacted by a disability. According to the statute, major life activities include, but are not limited to, caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, and working. Significantly, the ADA includes major bodily functions as a major life activity. Examples of major bodily functions include, but aren't limited to, functions of the immune system, normal cell growth, and digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. According to the ADA, physical or mental impairments do not need to be life-threatening to constitute a disability. For example, a food allergy does not need to cause anaphylaxis in order to be considered a disability. A non-life-threatening allergy may be considered a disability and require a meal modification if it impacts a major bodily function or other major life activity. A child's impairment also may be considered a disability even if medication or other mitigating measures reduce the impact of the impairment. Schools should be aware of the Individuals with Disabilities Act of 1990, also known as IDEA as amended. The U.S. Department of Education's implementing regulations for IDEA may be found at 34 CFR Part 300. IDEA requires each public agency to take steps to ensure children with disabilities have an equal opportunity to benefit from extracurricular services and activities, including meals. IDEA requirements may impact the service of meals, even when a meal service is not required by FNS. Any nutrition-related services included in a child's individualized education program or IEP deemed necessary for the child to receive a free and appropriate public education must be provided at public expense and at no cost to the child's family. Part B of IDEA funds may be used for this purpose. When nutrition services are required under a child's IEP, the local educational agency may choose to have the School Food Authority handle this responsibility. Please note, Food and Nutrition Services does not reimburse SFAs for meals provided to children with disabilities beyond the meals provided to other children. For example, if an SFA does not operate the school breakfast program, the SFA will not receive reimbursement from USDA for breakfast meals served to accommodate a child with a disability under an IEP or 504 plan. However, schools are reminded that they may have additional obligations to children with disabilities under the IDEA beyond the scope of FNS guidance. USDA's implementing regulations for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act are included at 7 CFR 15B, non-discrimination on the basis of handicap in programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance. As noted, the Rehabilitation Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in federal government programs, including programs operated by recipients of federal financial assistance. At 7 CFR 15B1, USDA prohibits the following discriminatory actions: denying a person with a disability the opportunity to participate in or benefit from the recipient's aid, benefit, or services, providing a person with a disability an opportunity to participate that is not equal to the opportunity provided to others, providing a person with a disability an aid, benefit, or service that is not as effective as the aid, benefit, or service provided to others, providing a person with a disability a different aid, benefit, or service, unless doing so is necessary to provide an aid, benefit, or service that is as effective as those provided to others. The requirement to accommodate children with disabilities is also included in program regulations at 7 CFR 210.10M and 7 CFR 220.8M. Schools must make substitutions in lunches and after-school snacks for students who are considered to have a disability under 7 CFR 15B3 and whose disability restricts their diet. Sometimes children require meal modifications that diverge from program meal pattern. In order to receive federal reimbursement for modified meals that do not meet the program meal pattern requirements, SFAs must require a written medical statement signed by a state licensed healthcare professional. Although it's not required by FNS, SFAs may choose to request a written medical statement from a state licensed healthcare professional in support of in support of a request for modification within the program meal pattern. SFAs will be reimbursed for modified meal that is within the meal pattern, regardless of whether they have obtained the written medical statement. Additionally, departmental regulations require recipients to notify participants, beneficiaries, and applicants that they do not discriminate on the basis of disability and to identify the individual responsible for providing modifications. This is found at 7 CFR 15B.7a. SFAs are encouraged to make the process of requesting a meal modification as simple and straightforward as possible. For example, SFAs are encouraged to include information about modification requests when sending out applications for free and reduced price school meals, to post a flyer with information about modification requests at the entrance of the school and/or school cafeteria, to include information about modification requests in the student handbooks provided to families annually, and/or to post information about the modification requests in the same place school lunch menus are posted on school or district websites. SFAs must notify families of the process for requesting meal modifications and the individual responsible for coordinating modifications. According to departmental regulations, methods of initial and continuing notification may include the posting of notices, placement of notices in relevant publications, radio announcements, and the use of other visual and auditory media. As part of this notification, SFA should explain when parents and guardians need to submit supporting documentation for their child's modification request. At the federal level, a medical statement is required in order for SFAs to receive reimbursement for meal modifications that do not follow the program meal patterns. Requirements for the medical statement are included in modifications outside of the meal pattern. SFAs may receive reimbursement for a meal modification request without a medical statement when the modification can be made within the program meal pattern. For example, if a child has an allergy to one fruit or vegetable, the SFA can simply substitute another fruit or vegetable in the child's meal. In situations where the SFA does not obtain a medical statement, FNS strongly encourages SFAs to make note of the actions taken to accommodate a child's disability. Doing so helps to safeguard children in all areas of the school environment and protects children in situations where substitute staff members who may be unfamiliar with their needs are working in the cafeteria. In addition, although it's not required at the federal level, state or local agencies may choose to require a medical statement for meal modifications within the program meal pattern. Certain physical or mental impairments require meal modifications that do not follow the required program meal pattern. In a disability situation, meal modifications outside of the meal pattern are reimbursable, provided the request is supported by a medical statement signed by a state licensed healthcare professional. When the medical statement is required, such as when the modification does not meet the meal pattern requirement, the medical statement must include information about the child's physical or mental impairment that's sufficient to allow the SFA to understand how it restricts the child's diet. Please note that this is not the same thing as requiring a diagnosis. Number 2, an explanation of what must be done to accommodate the child's disability. And number 3, the food or foods to be omitted and the recommended alternatives in the case of a modified meal. In other cases, more information may be required. For example, if the child requires caloric modifications or the substitution of a liquid nutritive formula to accommodate a disability, this information must be included in the statement. The medical statement must include the signature of an individual who is authorized to write a medical prescription under state law. In Louisiana, this is restricted to a doctor, a nurse practitioner, or a physician's assistant. FNS guidance refers to individuals authorized to sign the medical statement as state licensed healthcare professionals. When a new medical statement is submitted, school food service professionals must work closely with the Section 504 ADA coordinator or other designated officials so that the medical statement is clear and includes the information necessary to provide the child with a safe and nutritious meal. Establishing contact with parents or guardians may help to ensure all information needed to provide a safe meal is available. If a medical statement is provided and does not fully explain the modification needed, the SFA should immediately contact the child's parent or guardian for guidance and ask the family to provide an amended medical statement as soon as possible. However, clarification of the medical statement should not delay the SFA from providing a meal modification. SFA should follow the portion of the medical statement that is clear and unambiguous to the greatest extent possible while obtaining the additional information. SFAs must retain copies of medical statements when making modifications outside of the regular meal pattern in order to receive federal reimbursement for the modified meals. State agencies have the flexibility with regard to the method of record keeping, but the method selected must allow the state agency to review the justification during the administrative review. In situations where the medical statement is not necessary, such as the modification is within the program meal pattern, FNS strongly recommends SFAs keep documentation on file acknowledging the child's disability. This documentation protects children in all areas of the school environment and minimizes any misunderstandings. It's also extremely important for schools to protect the privacy of children who have a disability. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, otherwise known as HIPAA, and the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974, or FERPA, require medical information to be kept confidential. This includes medical information related to a child's disability. School officials are reminded that they may not request medical records or medical charts related to a child's disability as part of the medical statement. The school only needs to obtain the medical statement in order to receive federal reimbursement for modified meals outside of the program meal pattern. Schools must follow confidentiality requirements under IDEA, and questions about IDEA should be directed to the Section 504 or ADA coordinator. SFAs generally should not decline to provide a meal modification to accommodate a child's disability if the modification request is related to the child's physical or mental impairment and is supported by a medical statement. However, SFAs may decline a request for a meal modification that would fundamentally alter the nature of the program. A fundamental alteration is a modification so drastic that it would change the essential nature of the program. SFA should work closely with families to prevent any misunderstandings before declining a modification request. If an SFA concludes that the cost of the modification would fundamentally alter the nature of its program, the SFA must prove it cannot afford to make the modification based on all resources available to the LEA. For more information, see page 7 of USDA Memo SP 59-2016. If an SFA declines a request, the SFA must, under the procedural safeguards requirements, ensure that the child's parent or guardian understands their right to file a grievance if they believe a violation has occurred regarding their request for a reasonable modification, receive a prompt and equitable resolution of the grievance, request and participate in an impartial hearing to resolve their grievances, be represented by counsel at the hearing, examine the record, and receive notice of the final decision and a procedure for review, such as the right to appeal the hearing's decision. Next, we will discuss reimbursement for modified meals. In many cases, disabilities can be managed within the program meal pattern. For example, a regular reimbursable meal with only textural modifications, such as pureeing food for a child who recently underwent oral surgery, would still meet the meal pattern, as would a simple substitution of a fruit or vegetable component. Such a meal may be claimed for federal reimbursement regardless of whether the SFA obtains a medical statement for the child. But in other cases, a modification may result in the service of meals that do not meet the meal pattern requirements. SFAs will receive reimbursement for a modified meal outside of the program meal pattern when the modification is supported by a medical statement signed by a state licensed healthcare professional. The SFA will be reimbursed based on the child's eligibility for free, reduced priced, or paid meals. Additionally, Additional costs may be paid for from the nonprofit school food service account. For example, a child's medical statement indicates they cannot consume portion sizes equal to those outlined in FNS regulations at 7 CFR 210.10. Instead, the medical statement directs the SFA to provide smaller portion sizes. The SFA will be reimbursed for the meal, even though it doesn't meet the meal pattern requirements based on the signed medical statement. Reimbursement for modified meals is based on a child's eligibility for free, reduced price, or paid meals, regardless of the extent of the meal modification. SFAs will not receive additional reimbursement to cover the extra costs sometimes associated with providing a reasonable modification and may not charge children with disabilities an extra fee for a modified meal. Meals must be served for free or at reduced cost at reduced price to children who qualify, regardless of whether or not they receive a modified meal or a regular meal. SFAs may not charge children with disabilities more than they charge other children for program meals. Children with disabilities can often be accommodated with little expense or involvement, and in many cases, the SFA is able to absorb any additional expenses involved in making the modification. When necessary, however, SFAs may use funds from the nonprofit school food service account to cover the additional cost. When the nonprofit school food service account is not a viable option, the general fund or special education funds, as specified in the child's IEP, may be used to offset the cost. Sometimes SFAs receive a modification request outside the regular meal pattern before a child's parent or guardian is able to submit the required medical statement. If the SFA is aware a meal modification is needed, the SFA may not unduly delay providing the modification while awaiting the medical statement. And instead, the SFA should begin providing a reasonable modification to keep the child safe and request the family provide a medical statement signed by a state licensed healthcare professional to support the meal modification as soon as possible. In this situation, school officials must document the initial interaction with the family where school officials first learned of the child's need for a modification. School officials should not follow up with School officials should follow up with the family if the school does not receive the requested medical statement as anticipated and maintain a record of this contact. Schools should continue to follow up until the family submits a medical statement supporting the need for a modification. Once a disability determination has been made, SFAs are required to provide reasonable modifications to prevent discrimination on the basis of disability. A reasonable modification is a change or alteration in policies, practices, and/or procedures to accommodate a participating child's disability. Reasonable modifications to effectively accommodate children with disabilities must be made on a case-by-case basis. A meal modification must be related to the disability or limitations caused by the disability. A child's modification request extends to any food items and ingredients offered to the child. When accommodating a child's food allergy, no food item offered to the child may contain traces of substances that may trigger an allergic reaction. For example, if a child has a peanut allergy, no food served to the child may contain peanuts or include peanuts as an ingredient. This means food labels or specifications on food items children with allergies will consume must be checked for allergens. FNS recommends providing the child's parent or guardian advanced copies of breakfast and lunch menus so they can ask questions and raise any potential concerns. If a food label for a product served in the programs does not provide adequate information, it is the responsibility of the school food service to obtain the information necessary to ensure that no allergic substances are present. This may be accomplished by contacting the supplier or the manufacturer. Private organizations may also be consulted for information and advice. The SFA must also provide the child with a safe environment to consume the meal. This includes ensuring proper storage, preparation, and cleaning techniques that are used to prevent exposure to allergens through cross-contamination and may involve preparing a separate meal from scratch using ingredients allowed on the modified diet rather than serving a meal using processed foods. In general, school food service professionals should exercise caution at all times and should not serve foods to children with severe food allergies if the full ingredient list of a food product is not available. According to the FDA, the following major food allergens account for 90% of all food-based allergic reactions: peanuts, milk, eggs, wheat, soy, tree nuts, such as almonds, pecans, or walnuts, fish, such as bass, flounder, or cod, crustaceans, shellfish, such as crab, lobster, or shrimp, or an ingredient containing a protein derived from one of the 8 allergens listed on this slide. Improvements to food labeling have made it easier for school food service professionals to identify potentially dangerous foods. However, children may have an allergy to a food item not included on the list. Once an SFA becomes aware of a child's allergy to a specific food item or food items, the SFA should monitor ingredients carefully to protect the child's safety at all times. If a food label does not provide adequate information to assess the presence of a less common allergen, it is the SFA's responsibility to obtain the information needed to ensure no allergic substances are present in foods served to the child. According to FDA, the most common signs of a food-based allergic reaction include hives, itching, or skin rash, swelling of the lips, face, tongue, and throat, wheezing, nasal congestion or trouble breathing, abdominal pain, diarrhea, nausea, or vomiting, or dizziness, lightheadedness, or fainting. Please note that the children's symptoms may not always be overt or visible. School officials should be attentive to children's complaints of physical discomfort, faintness, or other symptoms which may signal an allergic reaction. CDC lists several phrases children may use to communicate these symptoms on their website. Examples include, "My tongue itches," "There's a frog in my throat," or "My mouth feels funny." To view the full list, please see Food Allergies in Schools at the link shown at the bottom of this slide. School officials should share this information widely throughout the school and develop a comprehensive emergency plan for situations where children experience an allergic reaction. A modification request may include portion sizes exceeding the minimum quantity requirements set forth in program regulations. When specifically prescribed in the medical statement, the SFA must provide the child with larger portions. SFAs will not receive additional reimbursement to cover the extra cost associated with providing extra food. However, SFAs may use funds from the nonprofit school food service account to cover the additional food costs. If the nonprofit school food service account is not viable, the general fund or special education funds, as specified in the child's IEP, may also be used. In other situations, a medical statement may prescribe portion sizes below the minimum quantity requirements set forth in program regulations. In this situation, the SFA is required to follow the direction of the medical statement and must provide smaller quantities. In some situations, a state licensed healthcare professional may request a particular brand name of a product as a substitute on the medical statement. For example, a medical statement for a child with a gluten intolerance may request a specific brand of gluten-free bread. If a modification request indicates a brand name item, in most instances, a generic brand is sufficient unless the brand name is medically necessary. This can be determined through the interactive process with the child's parent or guardian. In the example above, if the medical statement lists a specific brand of gluten-free bread, the SFA could check with the family to see if it would be safe and appropriate for the SFA to provide a different brand. In this instance, the family could then affirm the brand name change. Offering children a selection of nutritious foods within a reimbursable lunch may encourage children to consume a greater variety of foods. Offer versus serve, or OVS, allows children to decline some food components or food items as long as their meal meets certain requirements found at 7 CFR 210.10K. OVS gives children more control over their foods they consume and may help SFAs reduce plate waste and improve children's perceptions of the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program. At the high school level, OVS is required in the NSLP and optional in the SBP. At the elementary and middle school levels, OVS is optional in both lunch and breakfast. At schools participating in OVS, children with disabilities must have the option to select all food components or items made available to other children. SFAs cannot accommodate a child's disability by asking the child to exclude a food component or item from their selection. For example, a child who has celiac disease or a gluten intolerance must have a choice of a bread grain item that is gluten-free. The SFA may not use OVS to eliminate a specific food component for a child with a disability. In this case, the SFA must offer a grain substitute for a child who cannot consume gluten. Federal regulations specifically prohibit disability discrimination through contractual means, included vended contracts. SFAs must make reasonable modifications for children with disabilities, regardless of whether the SFA operates the food service or contracts with a food service management company. As applicable, modifications for children with disabilities must be included in the FSMC contract. SFAs that do not need dietary modifications at the time an FSMC bid is prepared should still include sufficient information in the bid to make certain the FSMC is aware that dietary modifications may be required during the term of the contract. Facilities and personnel must provide the necessary services to accommodate a child with a disability. In certain situations, modifications may require additional equipment or specific staff training and/or expertise. When these instances occur, it's important for school food service professionals and parents or guardians to work together prior to the child's entrance to the school to ensure the child has the opportunity to participate in and benefit from the programs. Departmental regulations state program benefits should be provided in the most integrated setting appropriate to the person's needs. This is found at 7 CFR 15B. Likewise, federal civil rights legislation, including Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the IDEA, and Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA, requires school districts to ensure children with disabilities are able to participate along with children without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. School officials must not segregate children with disabilities on the basis of convenience, and it is never appropriate to simultaneously use a separate table to punish children for misconduct. However, under limited circumstances, it may be appropriate for children to sit at a separate table. For example, if a child requires a large degree of assistance from an aide in order to consume their meal, it may be necessary for the child and the aide to have more space during the meal service. Additionally, an SFA may determine a more isolated eating area is necessary for children with severe food allergies. The separate eating area may be a designated table in the cafeteria, cleaned according to food safety guidelines to eliminate possible cross-contamination of allergens on tables and seating, or an area away from the cafeteria where children can safely consume their meals. Prior to developing a special seating arrangement, the school should determine, with input from the child's parent or guardian, and if reasonable, the licensed professional who signed the medical statement, if this type of seating arrangement is truly necessary. If the school does develop a special seating arrangement, other children should be permitted to join children with food allergies, provided they do not bring any foods potentially dangerous to those children. Some children may need to track their dietary intake. For example, diabetic children must track their carbohydrate intake. To accommodate a diabetic child, a medical statement may require an SFA to provide nutritional information for food options made available to the child. The SFA is not required to provide all nutrition information for all program meals, as it would be very burdensome to provide this amount of information. So in order to meet the child's need, the SFA could develop a cycle menu with the child's parent or guardian, the school nutritionist or dietitian, and nurse, and/or the child if he or she is age appropriate. Nutrition information could be provided for the foods on the cycle menu as opposed to all foods offered through the programs, reducing the burden on school food service professionals. LEAs must have a procedure in place to ensure parents and guardians know how to request a modification for their child and understand their right to examine the record and file a grievance in situations where a requested modification is not granted. This section provides an overview of requirements as well as encourage strategies in this area. Under the procedural safeguards requirement, LEAs must provide a process for the prompt resolution of grievances that includes the option for an impartial hearing. This is found at 7 CFR 15B. Specifically, the procedural safeguards process requires LEAs to provide notice and information to parents and guardians regarding how to request a reasonable modification. The notice must also explain the parent or guardian's right to file a grievance if they believe a violation has occurred regarding the request for a reasonable modification, receive a prompt and equitable resolution of the grievance, request and participate in an impartial hearing to resolve their grievances, be represented by counsel at the hearing, examine the record, and receive notice of the final decision and a procedure for a review, such as the right to appeal the hearing's decision. LEAs employing 15 or more individuals must ensure their procedural safeguards process provides for a prompt and equitable resolution of grievances and must designate at least one person to coordinate compliance with disability requirements. The individual is often referred to as the Section 504 ADA coordinator. In many cases, the Section 504 ADA coordinator is responsible for addressing requests for accommodations in the school in general. As part of their general responsibilities, this individual also may be responsible for ensuring compliance with disability requirements related to meal modifications and the meal service. Regardless of whether the coordinator works in the school food service, the coordinator must ensure school food service professionals understand the procedures for handling meal modification requests. LEAs are strongly encouraged to develop a Section 504 ADA team to discuss best practices and develop a holistic plan to create a safe learning environment for children. Using a team approach encourages information sharing throughout the school and may help protect children in situations where food is served outside of the cafeteria, such as during classroom parties. The most effective team will include school food service professionals and nutritionists, school administrators, school medical personnel, classroom teachers and aides, support personnel familiar with the needs of children, such as therapists and allergists, parents or guardians, and children when age appropriate, and other school officials with relevant experience, such as special education staff. It is essential for SFAs to work with parents and guardians to ensure children receive safe meals and have equal opportunity to participate in the programs. Involving parents and guardians early in the process allows school employees to develop rapport with families and prevents miscommunication or misunderstanding. This helps to ensure the needs of children with disabilities are met. The Section 504 ADA team also should respond quickly and consistently to situations where children are bullied due to food allergies. It is important to ensure school food service professionals understand the potential severity of even a small amount of exposure to a food allergen and the role proper food handling and sanitation play in a potentially life-threatening situation. Following hazard analysis and critical control points, or HACCP principles, helps prevent allergen exposure through cross-contact and cross-contamination. The Richard B. Russell National School Lunch Act requires SFAs to implement a food safety program based on HACCP principles. The food safety program must be applied to any location where food is stored, prepared, or served, and should include documented standard operating procedures. HACCP requirements are codified in program regulations at 7 CFR 210.13c. Including a food allergy action plan in the food safety program can help school food service professionals and others who are present when food is served prevent food-related emergencies. SFAs can include specific action items in the food allergy action plan related to cleaning and sanitizing food surfaces, personal hygiene, preventing cross-contamination during food storage, serving food properly, and preventing cross-contamination at salad bars. For example, School food service professionals and other school personnel could outline proper cleaning and sanitizing procedures for equipment, utensils, cutting boards, counters, griddles, and serving stations, specifically when working with ingredients containing allergens. SFAs are encouraged to consider children's cultural, religious, and ethical preferences when planning and preparing meals. Accommodating children's preferences helps to maintain participation in the NSLP and SBP. Variations, whether on an experimental or continuing basis, must be consistent with the food and nutrition requirements specified in program regulations in order for children's meals to be eligible for reimbursement. SFAs will not receive additional reimbursement for such variations and must cover any expenses in excess of program reimbursement incurred as a result of providing menu variation. So, what is not considered a disability when it comes to a food modification? A modification request is not considered a disability if it's a person's preference to follow a diet instead of due to medical necessity. Religious or moral convictions, such as no pork in the diet or following a vegetarian or vegan diet, are not medically necessary and do not have to be accommodated. Similarly, if parents have a preference for general health concerns, such as following a gluten-free diet or an organic diet due to preference, these are also not considered a disability or medically necessary, requiring accommodation. And lastly, personal taste preferences do not qualify as a disability requiring accommodation. So, what are you to do? You are required to ensure that any substitutions made meet meal pattern requirements if you are to receive reimbursement for such meals. According to USDA, you are encouraged but not required to meet those requests. When making accommodations for students for non-disability requests, it is not required that you obtain a meal documentation form, but it's always a good idea to maintain documentation for liability purposes. Fluid milk substitutions are among the most common menu variations for SFAs. SFAs must inform the state agency of any schools opting to provide a milk substitute or milk substitutes. This is found in 7 CFR 210.10M, and they must ensure milk substitutions meet FNS nutrient requirements. For example, low-fat or fat-free lactose-free milk or reduced lactose milk would meet the nutrient requirements. SFAs will not receive federal reimbursement for a meal that substitutes juice or water for milk for a non-disability reason. If a child's medical statement indicates the child cannot consume milk due to a disability and requests the child receive a substitute, the SFA must provide the requested substitute regardless of whether it meets the nutrient requirements. In a disability situation, the SFA will continue to receive reimbursement for the meal based on the signed medical statement. Here's a list of some of the improved milk alternatives that meet the nutritional profile of fluid milk substitutions. Next, we will discuss 9 different school food service scenarios and USDA's response to each of them. Scenario 1. A child with autism is very sensitive to food textures and will only eat foods with a smooth texture. Is the child's condition considered a disability? And if so, must the school food service make a modification for the child? Yes. According to the ADA, any physical or mental impairment impacting the major life activity of eating is considered a disability. Some children with autism have sensory sensitivities and prefer food of a certain texture or color. They may require the same foods every day and need to maintain a regular routine. If a child's autism impacts their ability to consume program meals, the SFA must provide a reasonable modification. Scenario 2. A school food service professional assumes a child's condition is not a disability because it's not listed under categories of disease and conditions in the ADA Amendments Act. Is this assumption correct? USDA's response is no, this assumption is not correct. As noted in the law, the categories of diseases and conditions are not meant to be all-inclusive. Therefore, more conditions will meet the definition of disability than are listed in the ADA. Each situation must be considered on a case-by-case basis. Scenario 3. A parent or guardian requests a modification to accommodate their child's celiac disease. The food service director has a family member with celiac disease and feels the modification request should be changed to match their own family member's approach to managing celiac disease. Is this allowed? USDA's response is no. Assumptions or stereotypes regarding certain conditions or individuals should never drive modification decisions. Each situation must be assessed individually, and modifications must be made on a case-by-case basis. Scenario 4. A child requires a modification outside of the program meal pattern for her food allergy in the previous school year. Must the SFA obtain an updated medical statement at the start of the next school year? FNS does not require SFAs to obtain updated medical statements on a regular basis. Once the medical statement is accepted, SFAs will continue to receive reimbursement as long as the medical statement is on file. However, SFAs are responsible for ensuring that medical statements on file reflect the current dietary needs of participating children and may require updates as necessary to meet their responsibilities. SFAs should carefully consider the burden obtaining additional medical statements could create for parents and guardians when establishing such requirements. Scenario 5. A child who previously required a meal modification outside of the program meal pattern no longer requires a modified meal. Must the SFA obtain an amended medical statement prior to ending the child's meal modification? FNS does not require SFAs to obtain written documentation from a state licensed healthcare professional rescinding the original medical order prior to ending a meal modification. However, FNS recommends the SFAs maintain documentation when ending a meal modification. For example, an SFA could ask the child's parent or guardian to sign a statement indicating that their child no longer needs a meal modification before ending the modification. Scenario 6. A child with a disability consumes their lunch at home every day. May the SFA receive reimbursement for a meal served to this child? The answer is no. SFAs cannot receive reimbursement for meals provided to children at home. NSLP and SBP meals are intended to be served and consumed on the school premises with limited exceptions, such as during occasional school-sponsored field trips or during the use of waivers. Providing NSLP meals outside of a school on a regular basis would fundamentally alter the nature of the program. Scenario 7. A number of children at a high school receive modified meals due to a disability. The SFA has medical statements on file supporting all of the modified meals. Is the SFA eligible to receive the additional 8-cent reimbursement for compliance with the program meal pattern? Yes, modified meals that do not meet the meal pattern due to a disability are still eligible to receive the additional 8-cent reimbursement. Scenario 8. The regular meal menu item for lunch at the local middle school is a whole grain rich pasta with cheese and vegetable toppings. Must the school food service director prepare whole grain rich pasta with lactose free cheese and vegetable toppings for a child with lactose intolerance? USDA's response is no. In a disability situation, the meal modification or a meal item substituted does not need to mirror the menu item offered each day. The SFA's responsibility is to serve the child with a safe meal that accommodates their disability, not to mirror the program meal served that day. In the example used in this question, the SFA would not be required to serve a whole grain rich pasta dish and could instead serve a different meal that meets the child's modification request, such as a sandwich with whole grain rich bread. Scenario 9. A large number of children in an elementary school have a peanut allergy. Should the school go peanut free? USDA's response is that universal exclusion of specific foods or food groups is not FNS policy, but could be appropriate depending on local circumstances. However, if a school chooses to enact a universal ban, The specific allergen must never be present in the school, as the family will assume that the school is a safe place for their child based on the stated ban. So that is our training for today. If you have any questions, please contact us here at the Department of Education Division of Nutrition Support. You can call us at 225-342-9661. You can also reach us by email at childnutritionprograms@la.gov. Thank you for attending this training, and please reach out if you have any questions.